It's the Brad and John Show.
It is the Brad and John Show. Today's date is March 25th. The year is 2025. This is the B block, the Bravo block, which means we started right about 7:20. Okay, John, to pick up on something that you made fun of me in the last segment. Okay, the Hoffmanns, okay? And once again, a lot of people in the listening area of this station, there aren't too many people that don't have a very firm opinion of the Hoffmanns, some being positive, some being negative. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say.
Matter of fact, it was just announced officially that they're not, or they're essentially postponing indefinitely. They're building the hotel. Now, if you know the story of the Hoffmanns swept into the Augusta area. And if you know the whole story behind the Hoffmanns, it was David and Jerry Hoffmann. Jerry's the woman, David's the dude. And they both grew up in Washington. He went to public high school at Washington High School. She went to private high school at Borgia. They got married, they moved away, they made billions and billions of dollars, and then they came back and decided they're going to essentially turn Augusta into the next Napa Valley, which, quite honestly, I don't think is working. Matter of fact, at this point, I would have to say the jury is still in, but the preliminary results are not very good, and to the point where they've abandoned a lot of their projects. They've sold off a lot of the stuff they bought, but yet it was in the news that the Hoffmanns are trying to buy Lee Enterprises. Now, I find this interesting because you make fun of the radio business all the time, that nobody listens to radio anymore, yada, yada, yada. And I still say that there are tons of people. It's not me, it's Nielsen. The interesting thing about it is I think most people would agree the newspaper business has just been rocked by the internet. I mean, you know, we're still kicking in the radio business. The internet business, or the newspaper business has been rocked. Why would anybody want to buy into the newspaper business, John?
I think, and again, my bias about radio comes from, as we discussed last Thursday, I don't know if people in radio are just wildly incompetent or they're just bad business people, or if the radio industry is dead. And I'm biased by my working with you over the last 16 months, Brad. I think that colors it a lot. But I think a lot of newspapers have been able to take their properties and make them obviously digital-based, focus on social, focus on video, instead of just a print thing. And I think that people with some vision, with some sense, that probably exist in the radio industry and come up with creative ways to work with advertisers, make video. You've told many stories, Brad, about people who do live stream up in Canada and involve the listeners and build a community and things like that. So if I'm David Hoffmann, and who, by the way, already owns 10% of Lee shares. So he began buying Lee stock last year, and now apparently owns about 10% of the stock already, which is a significant portion of stock. I think he would look at it and think, okay, this is a business that maybe a newspaper, maybe it's like radio, maybe there are some successful people, but over a period of time, you just attract a bunch of bumbling idiots that don't know how to make a profit.
Well, but the interesting thing is Warren Buffett is also buying newspapers. And there's a local guy, I believe he lives up in Troy or Bowling Green or something like that, who's buying a bunch of small Missouri papers. He recently bought the Community News, which is in North County and in St. Charles County. He also bought the Warren County Record, which was owned by the people that own the Washington Missourian, and he's bought a bunch of other papers as well too. Now, I would guess that he's doing something right, and it's really interesting because I had probably about a 30-minute discussion with a very, very, very prominent radio guy yesterday. I'm not trying to make myself sound like I'm an important kind of guy, but I called him for some advice and something like this, and he just said exactly what I've been saying all along. The problem the radio business has had is it's created its own issue with the big guys, you know, the monster companies, the Odysseys, the iHearts, the Cumuluses, who have sort of killed the industry by essentially turning. I mean, I gave you the example. And anybody who's a musician, and we talked about this a couple weeks ago, that if you are a Fender guitar purist, you want a Fender guitar that was bought pre-CBS. And if you ever watched the Wayne's World movie, there's a comment in there about he's looking for a particular Stratocaster that was pre-CBS. CBS.
Yeah, you told that story, yeah.
The same company that runs the television networks and all that other kind of stuff, at one point in time owned Fender guitars, and they ruined it. They cheapened the product, and the product got bad. Okay, the same thing happened in the radio business. The product got bad and still stays bad. The crazy part of it is there are small and medium operators who are doing very well in the radio business. It's the big guys because of the fact that they've taken the heart out of the radio business, okay? But isn't that sort of what the newspaper business did? I mean, didn't they sort of take the heart out of what they did? Or did they just get so fat and sassy and say, well, we're the newspaper, nobody's going to topple us? What do you think?
I'm not sure exactly what happened there. And I think that you eventually have a brain drain of, you have reasonably successful people. Like you have a leader and a good businessman, like, I don't know, a Bud James leaving the industry. So you have a brain drain, and all that's left are bumbling, incompetent idiots. And then you would have young people not wanting to go into the newspaper industry, not wanting to go into the radio industry, not even wanting to go into TV, because they look around and the Bud James of the world are not there, and only incompetent people are there. And they see industry trends, and young people coming out of college are like, why would I go into radio or newspaper when I can go do something much more significant, or even be a YouTuber than do, old-timey radio? Oh, let's be a newspaper man with a pen and paper. The gentleman who you're thinking of, by the way, is a guy named Schmidt, and his group is called the Westplex Media Group.
There you go.
They're
yes.
the home of the Warren County Record, the Montgomery Standard, and the Mexico Ledger.
Right. That's the guy. And no, so he bought them. He must, maybe he's a billionaire and needs to lose some money or something like that. But, maybe he's like Jeff Bezos and wants to buy the Washington Post as a tax write-off. But see, the problem is, my sister used to be in the industry for a long time. She worked at the Globe Democrat. Then when the Globe Democrat, she saw the wheels falling off the Globe, and she moved down to Houston. She worked for both the Chronicle and I think the Post, and then she got out of the newspaper business. But there's still money to be made in that. The problem was that a lot of people in the newspaper business essentially dug their heels in and says, well, no, nobody will ever topple us, just like the buggy manufacturers did in the early 1900s.
Or typewriter manufacturers.
Right, typewriter manufacturers say, there's no way people aren't going to use typewriters anymore. There are a lot of the newspaper business is more steeped in tradition because essentially it's been around for literally centuries. If you look at it that way, was the radio business is not. But I don't know. I mean, the crazy thing about it is Hoffman already owns newspapers. You knew that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, he owns a bunch, and now not big newspapers, but he owns small newspapers. And the interesting thing about it was, the guy that I talked to yesterday, who I talked to in confidence, I won't reveal his name, he essentially said, the same thing, that the stations that are making money are in the small to medium markets because of the fact that that's where the big boys aren't. Like the iHearts and the other ones, they're not in the small markets for the most part.
Yeah, so they wouldn't be in a Moberly, Missouri. They would focus on St. Louis and maybe Como or Kansas City.
Well, and Como has Cumulus, which is once again in deep trouble. Mary Brennan, I think is her name, who's the lady. And there's part of the problem right there. They brought in a non-radio person to run Cumulus, and all she did was
you mentioned that last week.
She's a bean counter, and I have nothing against bean counters. Bean counters rule the world. Let's be honest.
But there's a difference between her and Pittman. Go ahead, Brett.
Yes, and the big difference is he's an ex-radio guy and she's not. And by the way, I find this thing from what's interesting. I'll see if I can dig it up. Maybe for C-Block, this thing that somebody sent me, one of my radio dudes sent me something that was said by Lee Abrams, which was very fascinating. 3 aspects of successful media, and not just radio, but just successful media in general. So you have no idea why Hoffman would want the Lee Enterprises. Lee can't be doing well in the stock market, are they? I mean, you're the stock guy. What's their stock doing?
So there's thousands of stocks, and I don't follow them all. I have no idea how Lee has done. I've been in and out of it. I've been long and short of it years ago. I don't know. I mean, in terms of how profitable companies are, the best insight on the industry would probably be going back and looking at their earnings call transcripts, because unlike private companies, public companies have to actually talk about reality, and they have to report reality. So, Brad, when you say that the guy who owns these publications seems to be doing well, you have no idea what his balance sheet is. To your point, you have no idea if this is like a write-off for him, or if he's able to make payroll. I look at stuff like West News Magazine and the Mid Rivers News Magazine, and when I subscribe to them, I don't pay, but I have a free subscription, and I read them and I find them valuable, and they're filled with advertisements, and I guess they make money, but I don't know what their payroll is. And wouldn't you think in radio, when you talk about these smaller markets, Brad, don't you think it's like any other company that if they had good salespeople or creative salespeople or creative program directors or whatever, they would find a way to make it work? Because to your point, they would be, not only would the big boys not be playing there, but if you had creative ad salesmen or people who were competent at their job, wouldn't they be able to sell advertising?
Well, here's the interesting, and that's a very good point, because, John, I belong to the Cottleville Welland Springs Chamber of Commerce. I also belong to the St. Charles Regional Chamber, and I'm going to join the O'Fallon Chamber as well, too. There is never, ever, ever anybody from the big St. Louis media organizations in those chambers. And I'm not just talking radio. I'm talking television. I'm talking newspaper.
Yeah.
You never see anybody from the Post-Dispatch or any of the TV stations, radio stations, any of those people. They're not in the chambers. Now, I still say that's sort of the St. Louis public radio syndrome, that they don't think lives exist on the other side of the Missouri River, if you know what I'm saying. I mean, it's just like when you drive across the Blanchette Bridge, it really doesn't go into St. Charles County. It goes halfway across the river, and then you fall into the river, and you die, and you don't exist anymore. And the other thing was told to me recently by a radio friend of mine back in the day when I worked at the original KSOQ, had one station in the market, 98.1 KSOQ. We had 8 salespeople, okay? iHeart has 8 different radio stations, and guess how many salespeople I have, John?
1, right?
They have 7 salespeople. So in other words...
Yeah, you mentioned this last week, the
so
same data point.
The exact... you're going like, okay, you got 8 radio stations and you got 7 salespeople. Back in the day, if you had 8 radio stations, there'd be a sales force of cumulative of those 8 radio stations, probably 50 or 60 people. I mean, it's just like, I don't know. Who knows?
So
anymore?
Isn't it chicken or the egg? Like, you're not going to get good salespeople because they're going to be out there pushing some other product, like some other widget. So you're not going to attract quality salespeople because you can't pay money. And then you're not going to make money because you don't have quality salespeople, so you can't pay to attract good salespeople.
Well,
isn't that the chicken or the egg?
No, part of the problem there is that iHeart is going after what we call it in our industry called programmatic selling, where essentially you go on a website and instead of having a salesperson calling you, you go onto a website. Okay, I'm going to buy the Bull, and I'm going to buy 3 stations and 3 ads in Morning Drive, and blah blah blah. It's just like sort of like going on Amazon and you're putting together a schedule and things like that. Well, the problem with that is that it takes people, to be proactively moved to go to that website. Whereas when you have a salesperson, it's like anything. I mean, John, you can tell me, and I know you have experiences this, when you deal with a company that has a really good salesperson, I mean, don't you end up spending more money with that company for the most part?
Yeah, of course. And we haven't talked about this on the air before, I don't think, but I used to work closely with radio station owners and producers and program directors every day in agriculture media all across the country. And the number of creative people that would come to us and say, hey, we have an idea. For 50 grand, you get this. For 100 grand, you get this. For 250, we could give you this. And they're creative ideas for programming. You guys would get a weekly segment during drive time for 5 minutes between here and here, talk about whatever you want. And they would come to us with creative ideas. And that makes it easy for me to go to my boss and be like, this is the number 1 station in Bloomington. We're trying to gain share here. It's only 50 grand. Like, let's do it for 9 months. And then the other thing is, though, the station was competent enough to package up those pieces after we're done to provide value to us, to include us in station activities. So I worked with a ton of creative people, and I don't know if that still exists. I don't know. I'm guessing those stations are still around and have creative people and are making money.
See, you're making my point. My point is that how in the world, if you have 8 radio stations, and I'm not here to diss iHeart, but I'm essentially just stating the facts as I know them. If you have 8 stations, how can you have 7 people who can do that kind of thing, who can be very creative? And once again, the situation, as I said once again, the situation for you is, and here's the question, when those people came to you with those creative packages and went to your boss, didn't you end up buying most of those?
Yeah, and sometimes you're not going to take the $125,000 package because you legit only have 80 more to spend in that market. But then you spend 65, and then maybe you go to your boss. You go to your boss in 9 months and you say, look at how well this did. Like, we got to come back with a little bit more. And then they make the argument above them of why we need more money.
You know, I tell you what, the whole thing is just sort of, everything's sort of screwy. You know what I'm saying? I mean, there are things where I shake my head sometimes at where we've ended up with various businesses and things like that. I mean, like, for example, here's a crazy story. I mean, and we got 2 minutes left in the segment. Can I give you this really quick, this weird story that just surfaced? Okay, are you familiar with you're probably familiar with the car company Rivian? You know who Rivian is?
Oh, yeah, big competitor to Tesla. Yeah, Rivian makes great cars.
Right, and also what they do is, I don't know if you know this or not, they make a lot of, matter of fact, they have one of their major investors is Amazon. Did you know this story about Amazon?
I did not know that.
Yeah,
no.
And a lot of the big new vans, if you've seen some of the big very interesting looking vans are made by Rivian. They're electric vans. Amazon bought a stake in the Rivian car company. Okay. Fisker, are you familiar with Fisker company, which went bankrupt?
Yeah.
Okay, they came out with a car called the Ocean, and what happened with the Ocean was they sold, 20,000 of them, and then they went bankrupt, but there's all sorts of bugs. Chase Bank has teamed up with Rivian to buy back the Fisker Ocean cars. You get what I'm saying with this?
Yeah, so Chase can make money by buying them back, right?
Well, essentially, what Chase financed Chase had a deal with Fisker with financing these Ocean cars, and apparently a lot of people, when the car company went bust, and there were a lot of software glitches with the car. Some of them are literally bricked. They don't do anything. They're literally like a 4,000 or 5,000 paperweight. They don't turn on or anything like that. People stopped making their payments. So Fisker, is gone. They're bankrupt. So Rivian teamed up with Chase Bank to essentially say, hey, let's take a bad thing and turn it good.
So buy the scraps and then be able to go after and collect 30 cents on the dollar.
Well, but more importantly, finance a new car, a new Rivian, and you'll get like a rebate for turning in your old Ocean Fisker. You know what I'm saying?
I say, yeah. So everybody wins.
Right. So I'm thinking to myself, okay, I read this story last night. I thought to myself, wow, that's sort of fascinating because of the fact that if you've got a car which is orphaned, and the crazy part about this is there are guys all over the country who are now making some serious dollars, some really sharp guys who know these Ocean Fisker cars inside and out, who are fixing them for people, and they're writing new software for the cars, but essentially, there's nobody to support. There's no support or anything like that. And see, that's what worries me about the whole thing with the onslaught of these electronic cars. The computer-controlled cars. Every car nowadays is like that. What all of a sudden, if a year from now, or 2 years from now, or 10 years from now, that Stellantis, which has had some issues, through all the different permutations with Chrysler and Mercedes-Benz and the whole bit, what if they go under and say, hey, we're not going to support all these modules and all these cars? And no, the cars don't work anymore because the modules all die. You know what I'm saying?
I know exactly what you mean.
That's why I say go back and buy yourself an old Mercedes 3000 or 300D with a diesel engine that has no electronics in it, that if we get nailed by the EMP, we won't have any problems with the only cars on the road will be the old Mercedes 300D diesels. That'll be the only ones. And those will be the nerd guys driving around like me, right? Okay, John, time for a break.